Well now, are you settled? If so, then let's do our little trick. Let those eyes soften. Don't close them, just calm, as if the room no longer needs your attention. And you'll find that the longer you try to stay awake, the sooner sleep will come. Feel yourself sink slowly into the bed beneath you. Let it hold your weight completely, as though it's been waiting for you to stop resisting. Breathe gently and allow yourself to settle deeper with every breath. And if you hear something pause nearby, not moving, not leaving, stay exactly as you are. It's only listening, waiting to see if you'll shift. Now, let's begin tonight's stories. Fionn MacGregor had once been a name people said with a smile already forming. There was a time when he arrived at the field in a pressed tweed jacket, cap brushed clean, boots polished enough to catch the sun. He carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly where his hands belonged and what they were capable of doing. When he bent to lift a horseshoe, there was no hesitation in him, no testing of weight, no warm-up throw to feel his arms settle. He stepped forward, swung once, and the iron landed where it always did, clean and certain. People gathered early in those days. They leaned on bicycles, stood with arms folded, passed flasks between them. Children learned his name before they learned the rules of the game. Old men nodded when he played because there was comfort in watching someone who remembered how things were done. Meggers was simple in theory, a stake driven into hard ground, a measured distance, heavy iron shoes thrown in turns, each landing judged by closeness, by ring, by kiss of metal. Simple but unforgiving, it rewarded rhythm, patience, and a steadiness that could not be rushed. Fionn had all three at once. That was before the losses. They came gradually, without ceremony, a misjudged throw here, a shoe landing short by an inch there, a clean ring that once would have drawn a murmur now missing by a width of a finger. At first, people excused it. Bad day, wind off the bog, age catching up, though he wasn't old enough to claim it honestly. Year after year he returned, and year after year he fell earlier in the contest. He stopped wearing the jacket, the cap grew worn and soft at the brim. He began arriving later, slipping in among the crowd rather than standing apart from it. He laughed at his own mistakes in a way that was meant to sound casual, though the laughter never reached his eyes. Meggers had given him something once, a place, a shape to his days, and now it was quietly taking it back. The year before the next annual contest, Fionn walked alone along the bog road beyond the village. The ground there swallowed sound, even birds seemed to avoid it. The turf underfoot was dark and springy, breathing faintly with each step. He told himself he was only stretching his legs. That was when he saw the prints. They crossed the bog at an angle that made no sense, hoof marks, deep and clean, pressed into the peat as if something heavy had passed through. But there were only two. Left, right, left, right. No drag, no stagger, no sign of a second animal. These walked like a man would walk. Fionn crouched, touching the edge of one print with his fingers. The peat was warm beneath the surface, faintly damp, as if the ground itself had not yet decided whether to hold the mark or erase it. Curiosity took him farther than he intended. The tracks led straight out into the open bog until they stopped abruptly. No fade, no break, just an end. In their place lay a darkened circle in the peat, scorched black and brittle, about the width of a small table. At its center rested a single horseshoe. It looked ordinary enough, iron dulled by time, edges worn smooth by use. Fionn lifted it without thinking, and the sensation came immediately. Warmth spread through his palm, steady and deep, travelling up his arm and settling somewhere behind his ribs. It wasn't a rush, not excitement. It felt like standing close to a fire on a cold evening, familiar, comforting, a quiet assurance that everything was exactly as it should be. He stood there longer than he realized, holding the shoe, and in the end he slipped it into his pocket and turned back toward the road. The contest came around again, as it always did, marked on calendars and spoken of in shops and kitchens. Fionn told himself he would play one last time, for habit, for pride, for the sake of finishing something properly. He brought the horseshoe with him. The first match drew a small crowd, familiar faces, a few nods, polite applause. Fionn stepped to the line and felt his grip settle naturally, the iron resting against his palm as if it had always belonged there. He threw. The shoe rang, the stake, not clipped, not close, a full singing ring that echoed across the field. The sound cut conversation short. Heads lifted. Someone laughed softly in surprise. Fionn didn't smile. He simply reached down for the next shoe. Again, it landed true. The rhythm returned without effort. His arm moved as it once had, guided by something deeper than thought. The stake rang again and again, the iron singing its sharp, undeniable note. By the end of the first match, people had gathered closer. By the second, they stood still. Word moved quickly. By afternoon, the field was full. Men who had beaten him in recent years now watched with narrowed eyes as their own throws fell short. Fionn advanced through each round with a calm that bordered on indifference. He did not miss. In the final, he faced a man younger than him, broad-shouldered and confident, with a careful throw and a reputation for consistency. They stood opposite each other in the low light, the crowd pressing close enough to feel the heat of bodies. The younger man threw first, a good throw, close enough to draw approval. Fionn stepped forward. The iron rang. The final score wasn't close. People lifted Fionn onto shoulders he barely recognized. Drinks were pressed into his hands. His name rose again, louder than it had in years. He stood among men, nodding, accepting the praise with a quiet satisfaction that settled into him like a long, delayed breath. The horseshoe rested heavy in his pocket. 2 days later, the man he'd beaten didn't answer his door. When neighbors checked on him, they found his chair by the hearth scorched black, the wood beneath collapsed inward. There was no sign of any struggle, no trace of the man himself, only the mark burned deep into the floorboards, as if something had sat there long enough to leave its shape behind. People spoke of accidents, of fireplaces flaring unexpectedly, of bad air trapped in old houses. Fionn said nothing. The next year he returned again, and again he won. This time the runner-up was found days later in his shed, tools untouched, walls marked with the same dark stain. The year after that, it happened once more. Different house, same absence, same scorched reminder. Fionn felt the pattern forming long before anyone else did. He thought of the bog, the prints, the warmth in his hands. He also thought of the way people looked at him now, the pride, the gratitude, the way his name carried weight again. He kept that horseshoe. By the third victory, whispers followed him, quiet ones. No accusations, just questions that never quite reached his ears. He felt them in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, and the way laughter came a beat too late. At night he dreamed of fire beneath his own feet. The final contest he ever played came when his hands had begun to stiffen with age. His throws were slower, though still sure. The crowd treated him with reverence rather than excitement. He was no longer a surprise. His opponent that year was careful, respectful, and clearly afraid. Fionn won anyway. The man vanished 3 nights later, leaving behind a blackened bed frame and a smell that lingered for weeks. After that, Fionn didn't return to the field. He kept the horseshoe by his bed. Some nights he took it in his hands and felt the familiar warmth gather in his chest. Other nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet settle around him. He understood the cost. He understood the cost for years. When illness finally took him, it came quickly, a stillness in his chest, a silence where breath should have been. A neighbor found the bed empty the following morning, sheets folded neatly back, and no body. Only a darkened imprint where he had lain, burned into the mattress and frame alike, as if something had claimed its due and left nothing behind. The horseshoe was never found. Afterwards, people spoke more carefully. They spoke of burn marks left behind, of how the iron had never cooled, of how no man ever played that well for that long without paying something back. Old names crept into the talk, names their grandparents had used when they lowered their voices. Owl Nick. It was said the horseshoe had not been lost at all, only reclaimed, that it had belonged to something older than the game, older than the field, older than the man who carried it, a thing that lends skill the way a lender offers coin, with interest that never shows itself until the end. And if the bog keeps its secrets, some say it's because it remembers where that iron first came from, and waits patiently for the next hand willing to lift it. Fergus Hennessy arrived at Brackenrow House with rain on his shoulders and the taste of travel still in his mouth. The place sat back from the road behind hedges and a low wall that looked as if it had been built to keep quiet things in, not to keep trouble out. The yard was gravel, the air smelled of damp earth, and the building itself had the old, plain confidence you found in schools that expected boys to behave themselves without being asked twice. He stood for a moment with his case in hand, listening. Voices somewhere inside, footsteps, a bell, distant, sharp, and certain. Nobody was waiting to greet him. That was his first lesson. A boy about his own age walked past with a stack of books tucked to his chest and gave him a quick look, not unkind and not curious either, as if Fergus was already late and the world had no time for it. Fergus turned his head to follow the boy, and that was when another lad appeared at his side like he'd been there all along. "You're new," the lad said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation made with the ease of someone who'd seen plenty of new faces come through the yard and had decided, airily, what kind of welcome was useful. "I am," Fergus said. The lad nodded once, as if that settled everything. "Tig Devlin," he said, and he put out his hand. Fergus shook it. Tig's grip was warm, firm, familiar in a way Fergus couldn't explain yet. "Fergus," he replied. "Fergus Hennessy." Tig glanced at the case. "You've the look of a fella who's about to be marched somewhere with no idea where he's going," he said. "Come on, I'll show you where you're meant to be." He spoke like that in tidy little statements that made things feel manageable. Fergus followed him without thinking too hard about it, because the alternative was standing in the yard like a lost dog with a suitcase. Inside, Brackenrow House was all corridors and doors and the faint smell of polish that never quite won the fight against the damp coats and wet boots. Boys moved in small groups, heads down, shoulders forward, half awake, half trained. Someone coughed, someone laughed, someone was hushed. Tig led Fergus to a dormitory, then down again to a washroom, then to a classroom where desks were lined in rows and the windows were tall enough to make the sky feel far away. "You'll get used to it," Tig said as Fergus stood there taking it in. "To what?" "To everything," Tig replied, and he smiled, small and quick. "Or you'll go mad." That first day passed in a blur of names and rules and small humiliations that no one else seemed bothered by, because they'd already lived through them and survived. Fergus learned where to sit, where to stand, how to keep his hands still when the teacher looked his way. He learned that the boys who tried too hard were punished socially, and the boys who didn't try at all were punished properly. He also learned that Brackenrow House had a headmistress, Miss Keogh. Fergus saw her in a corridor, stopping to speak to a younger boy who looked on the verge of tears. She stood with her hands folded, listening, not rushing him, not crowding him, and whatever she said made the boy's shoulders drop like he'd been carrying a load he hadn't been meant to carry alone. When she looked up and noticed Fergus, her expression didn't change, but her eyes settled on him with a calm attention that made him stand straighter without knowing why. "New boy?" she said. "Yes, miss," Fergus replied, and his voice came out slightly too quick, and she nodded. "Brackenrow rewards effort," she said, gentle as a hand on a shoulder. "And it rewards honesty. Keep your wits about you, Fergus Hennessy, and you'll do well here." She moved on without drama, leaving Fergus with a strange feeling, half comfort, half pressure, and Tig leaned in when she was gone. "That's Miss Keogh," he whispered, as if the walls might take offense at the name. "She's fair. That's the best and worst thing about her." The days settled into routine, and routine did what it always did. It made time feel both fast and endless. Morning prayers, lessons, yard, more lessons, then lunch, then work and study, and the long stretch toward night when boys grew restless and tired and started saying things they didn't mean or doing things they couldn't take back. Lunch was always stew. Sometimes it had barley, sometimes it had a few extra carrots. Fergus and Tig sat together from the first week onward, and it became the sort of normal that felt like it had always been that way. They talked about home in small pieces. Fergus spoke about fields and a father who measured everything by how useful it was. Tig spoke about a mother who wrote letters with neat writing and a sister who could whistle like a bird. They spoke about teachers they liked and teachers they endured. They spoke about how long it was until the next break and what they'd eat when they got it. And they spoke about the boys who were sent home, not often at first and not loudly, but always with interest. It was never announced. It never came from staff. It traveled through the school the way smells travel through a corridor, quietly, quickly, with a certainty that didn't need proof. "Did you hear about Cormac Healy?" a boy said one lunchtime, leaning in over his bowl like the stew itself might be listening. "What about him?" another asked. "Sent home," the first boy replied. For what? Someone else said, eager for detail. The boy shrugged, then lowered his voice as if that made the story truer. Climbed out a window, tried to sneak to the road. They found him at the wall. That's some neck, another lad muttered. Will he be back? Someone asked. No, the first boy said, and he said it with the finality of someone who enjoyed that part. Not after that. Kyo's rules. If you try to leave, you leave. Fergus listened. Spoon paused and felt his stomach tighten a fraction. Tig caught his eye. It's usually something like that, Tig said later when they were walking the yard. Nothing mysterious, just lads getting notions. But they didn't even, Fergus began, then stopped, because he didn't know what he wanted to say without making himself sound childish. Tig understood anyway. They don't make a show of it, he said. That's the thing. Mrs. Kyo won't humiliate you. She'll just send you home. A week passed, and then another. The rumours came in drips, spaced out enough that they felt like part of the school's breathing. Porrick Lacey's gone. Why? Fighting, a boy said, and made a face like he'd tasted something bitter. Smashed a lad's nose against the sink. Was the lad all right? Blood everywhere, they said. Another time, a name Fergus barely knew. Garroge Kavanagh, sent home. For what? Stole a prayer book, someone offered, half scandalized, half amused. It's the lion, the first boy replied with a seriousness that sounded borrowed from an adult. If she catches you lying, you're done. Fergus kept his head down and did what he was told. That was his instinct. He also had a stubborn streak that made him want one small rebellion of his own, something that belonged only to him. He found it on a visit home. Not a long visit, just a couple of days, enough time to eat foods that tasted like his own kitchen, to sleep without 50 other boys breathing in his face, and to walk outside without permission. On the last morning, his cousin brought him into town and bought him a small hoop earring from a stall, laughing like it was a joke. Fergus didn't laugh. He stared at it in his palm and then at his own reflection in a shop window. He imagined himself returning to Brackenrow with it, not as a show, not as a performance, but as proof that he could still do something for himself in a place where everything else was chosen for him. He got it pierced that afternoon. It hurt more than he expected, a quick sting, then a throb that stayed, and when he returned to Brackenrow House, he kept it covered at first, turned slightly inward, hidden by habit, then by care. He waited until the second night to show Tig. They were in the dormitory, the lamps low, boys settling, whispers starting up like insects. Fergus sat on his bed, heart thumping, with the ridiculous fear of being caught doing nothing more than existing. Tig, he murmured. Tig looked over. Fergus leaned his head to one side and brushed his hair back, exposing the hoop. Tig stared at it for a full second, then let out a slow breath. You're some feckin' idiot, he whispered. But there was an edge of admiration there, too, the kind lads give each other when they saw someone take a risk they hadn't the nerve for themselves. It's small, Fergus whispered back. Small gets you sent home as quick as big, Tig replied. Fergus smiled. You're just jealous. Tig's smile returned. I'm sensible, he said. There's a difference. Over the next days, Fergus developed a routine for it. Night, wear it. Morning, remove it. Hide it in his case, wrapped in cloth, tucked behind a book like it was contraband. He told himself he'd never be caught because he was careful, and being careful made him feel clever. Kyo passed him in the corridors. She spoke to him once about his handwriting, and her tone was so kind Fergus found himself embarrassed by how much he wanted her to approve of him. You've got a good mind, she said, glancing at his work. Don't let impatience spoil it. Yes, miss, Fergus said. Her kindness made his secret feel uglier. It also made him cling to it harder because part of him resented that he cared what she thought. More weeks slipped by, more rumours. Thomas Grahan's gone home. For what? He was caught with drink, someone said, and it went around like a spark. Didn't his uncle bring a bottle in and he hid it under the bed? Jesus. Miss Keogh found it, the boy added with relish. She asked him straight and he lied, and that was it. Fergus began to notice something else. Nobody ever called Miss Keogh cruel, not even the boys who were fond of complaining. They called her strict, fair, steady, and sometimes, if they were in a certain mood, they called her soft, in the way lads call kindness or weakness, even while depending on it. It was the sort of kindness that expected you to meet it halfway. Fergus didn't, not with the earring. The morning he forgot to take it out began with him oversleeping by a breath, just enough to make everything feel hurried. A bell, boots hitting the floor, lads moving, voices sharp with morning energy. Fergus washed too quickly, dressed too fast, and followed Tig out without thinking. They were halfway down the corridor when Tig's face changed. Not much, just a tightening around his eyes. Fergus felt his stomach drop before he even understood why. He reached up. His fingers touched metal. A cold shock went through him, straight down to his knees. He stopped, tried to twist it, tried to pull it free without pain, without fuss, without anyone noticing. Miss Keogh's footsteps were already close. She appeared at the far end of the corridor, speaking to a younger boy as she walked, her voice calm, her pace unhurried. Fergus watched her approach with the same dread he'd felt watching storm clouds crawl over a field. And Tig leaned in. "Leave it," he whispered, urgent. "You'll tear your ear." Fergus swallowed. He forced his hands down. Miss Keogh drew level, her eyes flicking over Fergus with the same steady attention she always had. Her gaze paused at his ear, just long enough. "Fergus," she said. Her voice was gentle, which made it worse. "Yes, miss," he managed. "Walk with me," Miss Keogh said. Tig's face went pale. Fergus's mouth went dry as sand. He walked beside her down the corridor, boys pretending not to stare. The walls seemed to lean in with curiosity. Miss Keogh stopped near a window where light fell cleanly onto the stone floor. She looked at Fergus in that quiet, measured way that made him feel seen more than judged. "Is that yours?" she asked, and there was no anger in it. Fergus hesitated, and in that fraction of time he knew he was making the decision that would matter. If he lied, he'd be lying to a woman who had offered him fairness. If he told the truth, he'd be admitting he thought he was above the rules. "It is," he said. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "You know the rule?" Yes, Fergus replied, and his voice cracked slightly on one word. "This isn't about fashion," Miss Keogh said, still gentle. "This is about discipline and about the agreement you make when you come here. If you break it, you're telling me you don't respect the place and you don't respect yourself." Fergus felt the heat rise into his face. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say it was nothing. He wanted to say the rule was stupid. He wanted to say he could be trusted with one small thing, but he didn't. He couldn't. Something in her tone made him feel childish. "You've been warned before," she said, and there was sadness there, as if she hated the next part. "I kept you here because I believed you'd settle. I believe boys can settle. I believe they can grow." Fergus couldn't breathe properly. He started. Miss Keogh raised a hand, not to silence him, but to slow him. "Go to your dormitory," she said. "Pack what's yours, a letter will be sent, and you'll be collected." Fergus stared. That was it. no shouting, no public shame, no speech to the class. Just a decision delivered with the calm of someone who didn't take pleasure in punishment. "Yes, miss," Fergus said, because what else was there? He turned away, and as he walked back toward the dormitory, he felt every step as a weight. By lunch, the story had already changed shape as it moved through the room. "Tig," someone whispered, leaning in. "Is it true?" Tig stared at his bowl. "What?" he asked, though he knew. "Hennessy," the boy said. "Expelled." Tig's jaw tightened. "That's what they're saying," he replied. "For the earring." Tig didn't answer. He lifted his spoon, ate without tasting it, and kept his eyes on the stew like it might offer him some way out of the moment. A boy further down the table let out a sharp sound. Chairs scraped. Several lads leaned forward, curious. "What is it?" someone said. Tig stood up slowly. A small crowd had formed, heads bent toward the table. Tig pushed in just enough to see. At first it was only stew, brown, steaming, ordinary, and then his eyes found the pale curve caught in the congealed surface. An earlobe with Fergus's hoop. For a brief moment nobody moved, then somebody gagged. A chair scraped back hard against the stone floor, and the boy retched openly beside the table, stew spilling from his mouth in thick orange strings. Another followed, hands clamped to his face, sobbing as he retched into his sleeve. The sound spread fast, choking, crying, boots stumbling, a chain reaction of horror tearing through the hall. Tig stood frozen, his spoon still in his hand, his stomach turning so violently he thought it might split in two. The room felt wrong all at once, too bright, too loud, the clatter of cutlery suddenly unbearable. Every bowl and every table looked the same now, and every lad had the same thought, and none of them could say it aloud. Mrs. Keogh's voice carried from the top of the hall, calm as ever, asking for quiet. That gentleness, that same gentleness from this morning, twisted in Tig's head into something he had no name for. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something colder. He dropped the spoon. Around him, boys cried or vomited or stared at their bowls as if they might move on their own. And somewhere, beneath the noise, beneath the smell and the panic, Tig understood something that would stay with him long after he left Brackenrow House. Expelled? No. Those boys never left at all.
Well now, love, I've everything set out the way it should be. I know you'd be laughing at me if you could see it, me fussing like this, straightening a table that never once mattered to me when you were here, but you mattered. You always did. And you used to notice things, little things, and you'd say a house knew when it was being minded properly. So I minded it. The table's clear right back to bare wood. I even wiped the far corner, the one nearest the wall where I always left crumbs. You used to point them out when you were small, crawling under the table, handing them back to me like treasure. The fire's low, it's not out, I didn't let it die. You hated a cold room. Even as a baby you'd fuss if the air turned sharp, and I'd walk you up and down the floor until you settled, your head tucked under me chin, your whole weight thrusting me to keep you warm. It's warm enough now. It's not roasting, it's just right. I've the candles lit too. I spaced them the way you liked when you were older. You said it looked nicer when the light wasn't crowded. I don't know where you picked that up, but you were always full of little certainties. And I found the glass, the thick one, the old one, the one you chipped when you were barely walking, dropping it on the stone outside and bursting into tears because you thought you'd ruined something important. I remember lifting you up and sitting you on my knee and bouncing you until you laughed again, telling you nothing that breaks is wasted if it's still useful. You believe me. You carried that line with you. You said it about yourself sometimes later on when things didn't go the way you wanted. The glass is upside down now, in the middle of the table. My fingers are resting on it, lightly. I'm not pressing. I remember you telling me not to press. You said if you force things, they never told the truth. There are 2 slips of paper. I wrote them out slow and I took my time. My hand shook a little, but I kept going. One says yes and the other says no. I thought about writing more, your name maybe, or mine, but you always said too many words, only muddied things. You liked it clean and straight, so I kept it simple. It feels strange talking to you like this again, just kind of unfamiliar, like I'm using a voice I haven't needed in a long time. The one I used when it was just the 2 of us at the table, when you were small enough that your feet didn't touch the floor. The cottage is quiet, just kind of settled. The clock on the shelf still doesn't work. I never fixed it after you went. You used to ask why I kept it if it was broken. I told you it still knew the time, even if it didn't say it out loud. I don't know if you ever believed that. And I'll tell you straight, love, I don't know if this works. I've warned people away from things like this often enough. I've stood in kitchens and parlours and told them not to go asking questions they weren't ready for. I've said some doors are better left alone. But that was always about other people. I feel different when it's you. I was out today again, just down the road. They don't ask me to go far anymore. There was a woman there with a little boy, maybe 6 or 7, sitting tight against her knee. He had your look, that serious way of listening, like the story mattered and he meant to hold on to it. I told him a gentle one, no chasing or none of that shouting, just lights that wander where the ground stays damp and quiet, and he leaned forward the same way you used to, elbows on his knees and chin in his hands. His mother cried behind me while I spoke, softly. She thought I didn't notice, but I always notice. I think it pulled on her heartstrings a bit. The words still find their way, room still lean in when I lower my voice. The stories still do what they're meant to. It's only when I come home that it all kind of falls away again. I sit at this table and there's nobody swinging their legs, nobody asking what happens next, nobody telling me I've already told that one. You used to stop me halfway through and tell me I'd rushed something, do you remember? Or that I'd missed the bit that mattered. You were sharp like that, always had been, even as a child. You listened harder than most grown people. People think the storyteller does the work alone. They never see the listening that shapes it. My fingers are still on the glass here. It's cool, solid. I keep telling myself to stay with that, to stay steady. Do you remember the walks we used to take? Just the fields beyond the house? We didn't have much, no money spare, but you never complained. You said the world was big enough without paying for it. You'd bring bread with you, tucked into your coat like it was precious. You said it was only polite. I laughed and told you were an old woman in a child's body. You told me to mind my mouth. We didn't see anything on those walks, no lights or shapes, just the sound of grass and our own steps. But sometimes you'd squeeze my hand when the wind shifted, like you'd felt something I hadn't. When we got home, you'd laugh and call it nonsense. Still, you always checked the bread in the morning. You were never sickly. That's the part that still catches me. You're strong, always moving, always hungry. I used to bounce you on my knee until my leg ached and you squeal with laughter like nothing in the world could touch you. And then, in that winter, you slowed. Just a little at first and tired sooner, sitting by the fire longer than usual. You said you were fine. You always said you were fine. I wanted to believe you. When you took ill, it didn't crash in, it settled, quiet, patient, like it meant to stay. I did everything I knew how to, everything I had. There wasn't much, but it was all yours. I would have given you more if there'd been more to give. I watched you sleep and told myself watching was the same as helping. You never complained, and that was the hardest part. You still liked the stories. You said they helped you forget where you were. Sometimes I'd stop halfway through and realise you were already asleep. I kept talking anyway, I don't know why, but maybe I thought if I finished it properly, you'd wake. The cottage feels a lot bigger without you. Not emptier, just kind of stretched, like something important was taken out and the walls never quite came back in. They say a man shouldn't outlive his children. I don't know who decided that, but they were right. It feels like something's been turned the wrong way around. My hands are starting to ache. I hadn't noticed till now. I'll keep them here a bit longer, on the glass. You hated when people rushed things that mattered. I'm not asking for much love. I know that. I'm not asking you to come back and sit here and let me braid your hair like I used to when you were small. I wouldn't know what to do if you did. I just want to know I'm not talking into nothing. I want to believe that when I walk those roads on my own, when I leave this house and lock the door behind me, I'm not doing it entirely alone. That you might pass by now and again, just to see how I'm getting on. I don't know, maybe I'm doing this whole thing wrong with the glass. Maybe the mistake is thinking I deserve an answer just because I spent my life giving you everything I had. You always said not to push uncomfortable thoughts away. The glass hasn't moved. It looks the same as when I started. The papers lie flat across from it, waiting. I find myself smiling. You'd be rolling your eyes at me, you'd say, making a whole performance out of it. You always teased me when I took things too seriously. I suppose I better go to me bed, because an old man like me has to have his little bit of rest. I just hope that I'm not really alone, that you'll stop by now and again. That's all. Good night, love.
He went to bed. The cottage settled into itself, and the fire eased. The walls held steady. No footsteps crossed the floor, and no light shifted. The dark room remained exactly as he left it, And there, on the table, untouched in the quiet he'd given up on, the glass now rested beside Yes. Nobody knew why Podge O'Connor lived up a tree, not the men walking to early mass, not the women bringing bread home under their shawls, not the children who crept up the field edge for a look and ran laughing when they saw his boots hanging over a branch. It was a chestnut tree at the far end of a long pasture where the land dipped and rose again toward a scatter of cottages. The chestnut was old and broad. It had a strong fork low enough for a man to climb without a ladder if he had the nerve for it. Podge had the nerve. He had moved into its branches as if it was the most sensible decision a person could make. A bundle of clothes, a pot, a tin cup, a blanket, a coil of rope. He had lashed things in place so they wouldn't drop on passing heads. From the road you could see his little kingdom, bundles tied to boughs, a sack swinging low, a bit of canvas stretched like a poor roof, and the binoculars. They were old, blackened around the edges, the kind you might see at a fair or on a boat. Podge would lift them at the smallest sound, a crow calling, a cartwheel creaking, a dog barking too long. He'd raise them like a soldier, scan the fields, and lower them again without speaking to anyone. At first, people assumed it was drink.
Podge is after losing his sense,
one lad said outside Griffin's shop, looking up with his hands in his pockets. A woman with a basket of groceries sniffed.
If he'd lost his sense, he'd have stayed indoors like the rest of us.
Another man laughed.
Maybe he's waiting for the king to come over the hill.
The comments became part of the day, a small entertainment, until it wasn't. Because Podge didn't climb down at night. He slept up there. You could see the shape of him tucked in near the fork of the tree, his coat pulled over his face, his boots braced against the trunk. On cold nights, a weak glow would show through the canvas, only a little, as if he was afraid to let it shine. And sometimes, when the wind dropped and the road was quiet, people swore they heard him whispering to himself. It wasn't prayers or singing, it was something else, low and quick, like a man arguing under his breath. If someone called up to him, he'd behave as if he'd never heard it.
"Podge, are you hungry?"
an old neighbour shouted one afternoon, hand shading her eyes.
"There's stew here if you come down."
Podge lifted his binoculars and pointed them away across the land as if the voice was only weather. A farmer tried the same the next day. "Podge, for the love of God, what are you at?" No answer, only that distracted stare as if the fields were full of small movements nobody else could see. A week passed like that, then another, and the strangeness hardened into routine. Podge would come down once a day, never at the same hour, never when the road was busy. He'd lower himself hand over hand from the fork, boots searching for the trunk like a man coming down from a boat in rough weather. And when his feet touched the grass, he changed. He became a man on a mission. He moved fast. He moved sharp. He moved like someone late to a funeral. He didn't stroll, he didn't pause, he didn't look left and right the way people do when they're deciding whether to chat. He went straight for the path that had more stone than soil. If he had to cross a patch of bare earth, he crossed it with 2 quick steps, like it burned. Children noticed it first.
"He's after dancing over the ground,"
a little girl said, watching him from behind a gate. Her brother, mouthful of apple, nodded.
"He thinks something will grab his ankles."
That became a joke for a day. Then people started watching his boots instead of his face. Because if you stood still and really watched, you saw he was careful where he put them. He favoured stones, he favoured planks, he favoured the worn edge of a cart track where the hard bits showed through. And when he reached the road again, he didn't relax, he sped up. Griffin's shop was the only place he'd go. He'd slide in under the bell like a thief, head down, shoulders tucked in, eyes doing a quick sweep of corners and floor. The first time he did it, the woman behind the counter laughed, thinking he was playing a trick.
"Good day to you, Podge," she said brightly. "Would you look at you, up in a tree, are you?"
Podge didn't answer. He laid down his coins quick as a man throwing down cards. Flour, tea, a bit of cheese, a candle. Sometimes, though never a fat one, he took the parcels without meeting her eye. A man at the back buying nails leaned close to his friend. "Look at him," he muttered. "He's like a hare in a trap." His friend smirked. "Maybe he thinks the floor will open and swallow him." Podge heard that. You could tell because his hand twitched at the handle of the bag. He held the parcels tighter, knuckles pale, and he was gone again. Back out the door, back along the road, back toward the pasture. People tried to catch him on the way, thinking they might steer him home with kindness or shame. "Podge, come in for a cup," one man called, stepping out from a hedge. "Sure you can't live in a tree like a magpie." Podge swerved away without a word, nearly stepping into a ditch to avoid the man's boots. A woman shouted after him, half amused, half worried.
"Are you afraid of the ground, Podge? Is it the worms?"
Podge broke into a short run, not a sprint, but enough to show he couldn't bear the extra seconds. He was back up in the chestnut within the hour every time. People timed him out of curiosity first. Later, they timed him out because it made them uneasy, as if there was a rule he was obeying that they didn't understand. After a month, the tone changed, the jokes thinned, the gossip sharpened.
"What happened to him?"
someone asked in the pub one evening. A man with a pipe shrugged.
"He built that new house, didn't he? Big enough for himself and his father, God rest him. He was proud of it," another said. "Showed me the kitchen, a proper place, not a cottage at all. And now he sleeps in a tree like a bird," the bar lady said, wiping a glass. "There has to be a reason."
There was. It just wasn't the sort of reason people liked hearing. Podge had been well-to-do as far as the parish measures it. He wasn't rich, he wasn't a lord, but he had land enough to stand straight and money enough to pay a man to build him a comfortable house. He chose a spot close to the road with a view of the pasture and the low hills beyond. A fine place, good light, dry ground. He imagined evenings by the fire, boots off, a book in hand. He hired Morris Kelleher to build it. Morris was known in 3 parishes, a builder with quick hands and quicker prices. He'd turn up early, work late, and leave a clean sight behind him. He didn't waste words, he didn't waste nails, and he had a way of making people feel lucky they got him before somebody else did. On the day Morris agreed to the job, he stood with Podge at the chosen spot and tapped the earth with his boot. "Good ground," he said. "Stone close enough too. Will do you proud." Podge had smiled.
"As long as it stands."
"It'll stand," Morris said, and the way he said it had a confidence that felt like comfort. The building went up without fuss. There were no accidents, no smashed thumbs, no broken timbers, and Morris and his lads kept their heads down and their work steady. Podge moved in before the plaster was fully dry. He was too pleased to wait. The first night, he slept like a man who believed his life was finally in order. The second night, he woke with a thought in his head that wasn't his. Not a voice you could point to, not a sound you could blame on a rat or a bird. Whispers, close, as if the walls themselves had learned the shape of his name and were trying it out for amusement. Podge sat up in the dark and listened, waited for the sense of it. He waited for a clear word. He waited for a cough. He waited for a neighbour's step outside. None of that happened, only the feeling of being spoken about. He lit a candle and walked the rooms, the kitchen, the hall, the small parlour, the bedroom. He pressed his ear to the plaster like a fool and heard only his own breath. He sat down again, candle on the table, and tried to laugh at himself, and then the whispers started again. Petty, as if a group of cruel children were pressed right against the inside of the wall, giggling into their hands. Podge blew the candle out and lay down. The whispers grew bolder, as if the darkness pleased them. He lit the candle again, and the whispering slid away a little, like it didn't light the flame. Podge told himself it was his own nerves. He told himself it was the wind. He told himself it would pass. It didn't. The nights became a pattern. The whispers waited until he tried to rest. They did it in bursts. They did it like mockery. They did it as if they knew what would get under his skin. Sometimes it sounded like someone repeating his own thoughts back to him. Sometimes it sounded like laughter with no joy in it. Once he heard a whisper that carried the shape of his late mother's voice, and he sat up so fast he nearly tipped the bed. He went straight to Morris the next day. Morris was in the yard measuring boards, a pencil tucked into his ear. Podge didn't dress it up.
"Are you hearing anything strange in that house?"
he asked. Morris looked up, eyes calm.
"Strange how?"
Podge felt his own face heat.
"Whispering at night."
Morris's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Old houses make noises," he said. "New houses do too. Timber settling, air shifting." Podge stared at him.
"No, it's not timber."
Morris shrugged. "You're tired. You'll get used to it." There was something in his voice, not guilt you could prove, something else, a guardedness, a carefulness, like a man stepping around a hole. Podge tried again, softer.
"Where did you get the stone?"
Morris's eyes held Podge's for a beat too long. "From the stone pit," he said at last. "Same as always." Podge nodded, as if that settled it. He leapt with his stomach in a knot, because he knew Morris had chosen that answer like a man chooses a lock, and that afternoon Podge walked to the pit. It wasn't far, a cut in the land where men had been taking stone for years. Not a grand place, just a working wound in the earth with heaps of rock and a few tools left under canvas. Podge went on foot. He kept to the hard parts. He kept his steps quick, as if speed could protect him. He reached the pit near dusk. No men were working, no carts, no voices, only the hush of evening and the smell of damp stone. At first it looked ordinary. Then he saw the corner. One section had been half blocked off with rough planks. Not a fence, not a proper barrier, a suggestion. Across the planks were scratchings, symbols that didn't belong to any mason's mark he'd ever seen. Simple shapes, lines crossed, circles cut in half. A pattern that made his eyes slide away without understanding it. And at the base of the planks was a line of salt, placed as if someone had laid it there with care. Podge stood back a few steps, feeling a strange pull in his chest. Part of him wanted to turn and run, but part of him wanted proof more than he wanted comfort. So he moved closer. He stepped over the salt line. Nothing grabbed him, nothing rose. He reached the edge of the cordon stone and saw what the planks were hiding. The rock face looked eaten, Swiss cheesed, the way you said, but worse in truth because the holes were too neat, too round, too clustered. They ran into the stone like a nest, like a city, like 100 burrows all leading into the same dark. Most of the holes were near ground level. Podge crouched. He lowered himself onto one knee, hand on stone for balance, breath short and quick. The stone felt cold under his palm. It felt old. He leaned in and peered into one of the holes. At first, he saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted, and something adjusted back. A shape shifted just inside the dark. A small silhouette crouched low, the suggestion of wings folded close, not feathers, not like a bird, like thin membranes held tight against its back, and 2 eyes, white in the darkness. The creature didn't blink. It didn't move toward him. It simply held him, as if it had been waiting for a face to appear at the mouth of its tunnel. Podge felt his stomach drop. His hand slid on the stone, and he caught himself on the other palm, both hands on the ground, his body low in a way that made him feel exposed. That was the moment the thought struck him, sharp and clear. It wasn't the walls. It wasn't the house. It was what lived inside the stone, and what lived under the ground. Podge pushed himself back so fast he nearly fell. He scrambled up, dirt on his knees, heart beating hard enough to hear. He stepped backward over the salt line without even looking down. As he backed away, the whispering in his head started again, faint at first, then clearer. Not words he could repeat. The shape of ridicule, the sound of being laughed at by things that didn't care whether he understood them. Podge ran. He ran like a man escaping a dog, boots slipping on stones, hands out for balance, mouth open, breathing hard. He didn't stop until he reached his house. He didn't go inside. He stood at the threshold, candle in hand, and listened. The whispers were waiting, patient, amused. Podge turned away from the door. He crossed the yard without looking down. He stepped on stones, on boards, on anything but soil. He moved like the ground itself might open. He made for the chestnut tree at the far end of the pasture. He climbed until his arms shook. He climbed until the house looked small below, a tidy lie of stone and timber. Up in the fork he sat with his back to the trunk and stared out over the land. The whispering eased, not gone, just quieter, held at a distance by height and bark and air. That night he didn't go back down, and he never properly went back down again. From the road people saw only the strange man in the branches, the odd routine, the quick runs to Griffin's shop, the way he avoided soil like it was poison. They didn't see the house whispering into his ear in the dark. They didn't see the white eyes in the stone. They didn't see the salt line that Morris Kelleher laid down after he had already taken what he wanted, because Morris did take it. He had dug where he shouldn't have for a few quick pounds, thinking stone was stone and stories were stories. A non-believer with a shovel, a hard man with bills to pay. He'd found the good rock close to the surface and told himself he'd be a fool to leave it there. The salt and markings came later. People said he started putting them after he'd seen something in the pit that made him go pale. People said he stopped whistling at work. People said he stopped sitting with his back to a wall, as if he'd learned there were places you didn't turn your shoulders, and still he kept building. He didn't warn anyone. Maybe he couldn't, or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he told himself it wasn't his fault once the stone was loaded on the cart. Greed forced his hand, people said. Fear held his tongue. By the time the rumours caught up, the houses were already standing across the county, neat and proud, their walls full of quiet mouths. Some said Mars had made a bargain to save himself. Not a bargain you could sign, a bargain you lived, pass it on, and it leaves you alone. Some said he failed anyway. They said he spent his last years in an asylum, swatting at empty air, slapping at invisible things that clung to his sleeves. They said he lived far longer than any man had a right to live. One nurse swore he was still arguing with someone when he finally died. They said he was 137 years old. People laughed when they told that part. They laughed the way people laugh at a scary story they don't want to believe. And Podge wasn't the only one who was dealt a funny hand by Morris. There was a woman over in County Waterford, they said, who refused to sleep in her own bed. She had her mattress dragged onto the top of a wardrobe, and she lay up there every night, ankles tucked in, staring at the ceiling. There was a man in County Laois who stopped walking his own fields. He moved from fence post to fence post on planks like a man crossing a bog, and his neighbours called him soft until they saw his hands shaking when his boots sank into the mud. There was a family in County Carlow who built a platform in their parlour, a raised floor of boards on barrels. They ate their supper up there like birds on a shelf, refusing to let their feet rest on the flagstones. And down in County Wexford, a widow was said to have moved her whole life into her attic, rope ladder pulled up behind her, leaving the front door neat and locked as if she still lived below. And don't even get me started about old Marty McBride and his 10-foot stilts. Perhaps that's a story for another time. Different people, different habits. Same builder, same stone, same quiet idea that something lived under the ground, listening. Back in the chestnut, Podge O'Connor lifted his binoculars again. A distant hedge line shivered with a movement he didn't trust. He licked his finger and held it up to the air, reading the wind like a sailor. Below him, a man on the road tipped his cap and called out, half joking, "Any news up there, Podge?" Podge didn't answer. He drew his parcels closer to his chest and kept his eyes on the land. When you wake in the morning, please like, subscribe, and leave a little comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Those little clicks and words are what keep this channel alive. The small echoes that allow the stories to return. Come back every night. Let this be your resting place. Good night.